I feel like Judges chapter 4 can very clearly be labeled as girl power, because I just love all the girl power in this chapter. We start off by reading about the unfortunate disobedience of Israel. And of course, as we've learned already, that is a repeated cycle that Israel has done with God. And it's something that we should all take note of. We don't want to end up in that same cycle. We want to live a life that that gratifies God, a life that shows, that we are living his word, actively living his word. We don't want to be back and forth and hot and cold. We don't want to only seek God for the things that he can do for us. Seek him and be obedient in that. So Israel, they continued to sin against God. And so the Lord put them in a difficult spot. It said clearly in verse 2, so the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan. So what I found interesting, and I know I've touched on this before, is sometimes we will think that we're in a hard situation because of, whatever circumstance, or maybe we think like, I'm getting attacked by Satan, which that does happen. Jesus was attacked by Satan in the wilderness, so we can't be, we have to also understand that that can happen. But sometimes God puts us in hard situations too. Sometimes we don't listen immediately. And so when we are put in a trial, that'll kind of give us that pressure to listen, right? To obey. And so Israel, they weren't listening, they weren't obeying, they're in another trial. It's a cycle. So the Lord sold them into the hand of that king. And so they were oppressed for 20 years. Verses 4-5, Deborah was the judge at this time. And I love how it was a female. We see many male judges, but now we get to talk about Deborah. And so in verses 6-9, she gave Barak instructions to gather an army to defeat Sisera. And he wanted Deborah to go with him. That tells you how much power she had. And also it speaks volumes to, her relationship with God, her faith in God. He wanted her to go with him. It was a huge task. I mean, they were oppressed for 20 years. Of course, he was probably afraid. So she went and she said, be mindful that Sisera will be handed over by a woman. And so when you first read it, you kind of probably think that it'll be Deborah, but it's not. We'll keep reading. And then in verse 11, Heber separated himself from the Israelites. And I tried to do a little bit of digging. I could have probably kept searching. I just wanted to know why. I was curious why he separated himself. Sometimes separation from others sometimes is a good thing if you just need a moment to kind of get back on track, especially with God, separate all the external voices and focus truly on God. Kind of like the idea of like going away to like a Christian retreat. You're separated. You're with other people there too, which is really nice, a sense of community. But it seemed like they had separated because their tent was even set up where they were living. Their dwelling was separated from the rest of the Israelites. And I don't know why, but it doesn't really matter because God used it anyway. And so in verses 12-13, Sisera gathers his troops. In verse 14, Deborah, again, she encourages Barak. I thought it was encouragement anyways. I could imagine him thinking, how am I going to do all this? In verse 14, she said to him, get up, for this is the day the Lord will hand Sisera over to you. Is not the Lord leading before you? So he listened. And it's the same for you too. If there's something that's huge before you, I know I had something recently and I was telling my husband, like, I just want to skip this day because this is such a big task. But then the day came, I did what I had to do and then it went. And I was just so grateful that God helped me through it and led me through it. And he is with us. He leads us. He guides us. So she encouraged Barak. She reminded him that God is with him. Verse 15-16, Sisera's army, they all died, the whole army. And Sisera himself escaped, and he probably thought, well, I got away, and he ran to the tent of Heber's wife, Jael. And Jael, she's so wise. She went out to meet him. I'm sure, she knew that he was an enemy of Israel and how he had persecuted God's people for so long, or he was a part of that at least. And so, he said, can you please give me something to drink? And she gave him some milk. She covered him up and he said, can you just stay watch, at the entrance of the tent, make sure that if someone asks if there's a man here, you can say no. And she said, she did it. And then when he fell asleep, she took a tent peg and quietly went up to him and drove it through his head. And I read online as well that the women were very well versed with the tent pegs because they were responsible for setting up the tent and getting that situated. And so when Barak caught up to Sisera, Jael told him, I'll show you where he is. And he was dead in the tent. And so the Israelites were able to overcome Jabin and that oppression. And so, yeah, that was the story. Reading through the book of Judges, wow, it is a gory chapter, but we can see that, in this way, especially in this story, we see that God brought about justice for people who were oppressing his people. And also we can see, how he used even someone who thought that they were separated from Israel. They separated themselves from Israel, and they ended up being, as part of God's plan for their ultimate rescue. So yeah, that's all I had for today. Let me know what you learned. I post a new video on Wednesdays and Fridays at 7 a.m. Eastern, and I can't wait to study the Bible with you again. Bye.